Welcome, everybody. This is our, I think this will be our last KUASIA webinar for this semester. And I am very, very happy today to have Dr. Seiko Mimaki, who will be joining us from Japan. And the title of her talk will be Towards Gender Equality, Japan's Struggles. And let me first introduce her. Dr. Seiko Mimaki is Associate Professor at Takasaki City University of Economics in Japan. And she received her BA, MA, and PhD from the University of Tokyo. And she was also a visiting fellow at Harvard University and Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Mimaki explores various transnational reconciliation and peace building efforts in human history. And her recent publication includes a co-author book entitled International Society in the Early 20th Century Asia Pacific, as well as a recent article called Worst Time Since End of World War II Towards Societal Reconciliation Between Japan and Korea. And I believe the talk will be related to this recent article. We were hoping to invite Dr. Mimaki in person to Istanbul last year, but because of all the pandemic, we weren't able to do that. But fortunately, at least we can have this webinar online. And once things improve, hopefully we will have her in person again. But today, so I am very happy to have her. And like always, the format of the webinar will be that the participants will be first muted, but you can still put your questions in the chat box or in the Q&A box. But in addition to that, at the end of Dr. Mimaki's talk, you will all be unmuted, so you will also have a chance to give any questions with your microphone if you like, or of course you can write it down in the Q&A as well. So with further ado, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Mimaki.
Thank you, Aiko, for your very kind introduction. So actually, we are old friends and we study together. So in many senses, I'm very happy to be here. And of course, I'm happy to be with Aiko and also with the audience. Thank you for coming. And I hope that after my presentation, we can have we can exchange our view. Are you okay?
It's okay. I can hear you fine.
Okay. Exchange view and have discussion. So first, let me share my slide. Okay. So toward the gender equality, Japan's struggle. So first, so today I want to first discuss. Should I go join? So I okay.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
So there's no reflect. 反響ない？大丈夫？
一瞬あったけど大丈夫だと思う。
So first, let me introduce comfort women issues as a source of political tension between Japan and South Korea. So now, pundits say this is the worst time for Japan and South Korea. For example, this is a research by NPO, Genron NPO. So, for example, over 70% of Korea say they have relatively bad impression toward Japan, and also 60.3% of Japanese say they have negative view on Korea. So yes, overall the situation is bad, but that now is almost the worst timing, the worst time for both countries, especially Korean people's feeling towards Japan is quite bad. And also yesterday we had a new research conducted by Korean Economic Research Institute. So according to them, only 60.7% of South Koreans feel friendly towards Japanese, and 20% of Japanese do so. So or feeling, mutual feeling is quite bad. But still, there's some hope. So the respondents who said they hoped both government, Japanese government, Korean government, make effort to build a cooperative relations. Well, almost 80% in South Korea and 644.7% in Japan. So there's some hope, but currently the people in both nations have quite bad feeling toward each other. So, for example, finally the Hate Speech Act in Japan finally enacted several years ago. But before that, we have seen this kind of anti-Korean demonstration in the center of Tokyo. So let me introduce briefly.
In Japan, foreign residents, mainly Koreans and Chinese, have been the targets of discrimination by a number of nationalist organizations. Japanese lawmakers calling for a bill to prevent discrimination and hate speech. But many Japanese say this should have been done much earlier. CCTV's Terrence Terashima reports.
Around 100 nationalists marched down the Tokyo streets, shouting harsh, discriminating words against Korean residents in Japan, telling them to go home and return the disputed Takeshima or Doctor Islands. And equally many Koreans living in Japan and Japanese sympathetic to the Korean residents shouted back to stop the discrimination. Unfortunately, scenes like these have increased in the past 2 years, much more frequent and worse in Osaka, which has the largest Korean population in Japan. Some discriminatory demonstrations are also held in small residential shopping streets like this, targeting Korean residents in Japan. Japanese and foreign residents alike are asked.
So this kind of anti-Korean demonstration, but so the number is decreasing after this hate speech act was enacted. But still, so as we already seen, the mutual feeling toward each other, Japanese people's feeling toward Korea, it's not good.
In Japan,
So recent sociological study has revealed that main participants of this kind of anti-Korean demonstration are middle-aged men. So these middle-aged men have experienced Japan's high economic growth from the 1960s to the 1980s. So these guys, middle-aged men, so they cannot adjust themselves to a changing balance of power since 1980s. So Korea is becoming a huge economic power. And so this kind of political economic change, they cannot adjust themselves. And it's led to the anti-Korean feeling. So if we look at more younger generation, for example, they are Korean idols. These young Japanese, they have quite a positive view on Korea, especially they evaluate Korean pop culture. So this kind of Korean idol group, they are twice. So they are featured by NHK, Nippon Hoso Kyokai, Japan Broadcasting Company, Corporation at the end, a very famous end year song contest. So young people, through culture, they have quite a positive view on Korea. So we see some generational gap about the perception of Korea in Japan. And also this is a magazine for Japanese teenagers. So once Korean girls were imitating Japanese girls, but now the opposite. So Japanese girls are trying to imitate Korean girls, and they really like Korean style, Korean fashions. And also before COVID-19, we have seen the increase of Korean tourists to Japan. So before COVID-19, the Chinese tourists was the largest group, but almost the same number of South Korean tourists came to Japan. So let me briefly summarize. So we are seeing quite paradoxical situations. So we we are seeing generational gap about perception of Korea. And also we are, on one hand, we are seeing deepening cultural ties among young people, but this cultural tie coexists with political tensions. So let me go into the main topic today, the source of political tension. So one of the greatest sources of political tension between Japan and South Korea is comfort women issue. So I think there many of you have already known what the comfort women issue is and what happened during World War II. But let me introduce Women's Active Museum on War and Peace website. この画面共有をちょっとどうやってんだっけ。これ一回共有を停止して
共有を直す。
で、あれなんかOkay. So this is also the website. So the Japan invaded East Asia and then Southeast Asia. So in occupied area, they created so-called comfort station, and they violently raped the ladies and even young girls in the occupied area. So this group created this detailed map. So, and where the comfort station were, and even we can see more detail about each comfort station. So if we look at, so if you are interested in it, so you can see, you can go this website later. So okay, so go back. So I have to emphasize this problem, comfort women issue, were long neglected problem. For example, after the end of World War II, the Tokyo Tribunal did not punish Japanese leaders and Japanese soldiers for their sexual violence. And also, so during 14 years of negotiation for normalization between Japan and South Korea, neither the Japanese government nor the Korean government raised this issue of comfort women. At that time, for Korean government, economic assistance from Japanese government is the highest the importance. So not only Japanese government, but also South Korean government had been long silenced about this issue. And finally, in 1990s, finally first comfort women spoke out. She is Kim Hak-sun. And of course, there was a pressure not only from Japan, but also Korean society, because rape victims were isolated and discriminated in Korean society as well. So that's why she became emotional and was crying. But after his brave speaking out, we have seen a moment of reconciliation between the two governments in 1990s. Japanese government several times gave official apology in 1990s. So, for example, the important one is statement by the then Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono. So he admitted that Japanese military was directly or indirectly involved in the establishment and management of the so-called comfort stations. And the Japanese government extend its sincere apologies. And then, so 2 years later, the then Prime Minister Tomichi Murayama, so he admits Japan's colonial rule and aggression. And he also expressed my feeling of deep remorse and heartfelt apology to the people victim by Japanese soldiers, Japanese occupation. And also, so Japanese government tried some compensation for the former victim, especially comfort women. So they created the Asia Women Fund. So Murayama government set up the Asia Women Fund with public donation and state funds. So, and they tried to offer compensation for surviving comfort women, of course in South Korea, but also in Taiwan, Philippines, Indonesia, and Netherlands. But some comfort women and their supporters were not satisfied because this fund was not purely governmental. So this is a mixed private public foundations. But these comfort women and their supporters demanded purely official apology and compensation. So after that, since 1990s, so a little bit earlier, the creation of Asia Fund. So from 1990s, Wednesday Comfort Women Rally began and continued until today. So
Now, the 14th 100 weekly Wednesday rally near the Japanese embassy in South Korea will be held in Seoul today. It falls on August 14th, which was designated by the Korean government as the International Memorial Day for Comfort Women last year, as well as being one day before Korea's National Liberation Day, which is a national holiday here. The rally has been held every Wednesday for 27 years, calling on Tokyo to offer an official and sincere apology and pay appropriate compensation to the Korean victims of Japan's wartime sexual slavery. These victims are commonly known as comfort women. This week's rally is being held under the theme of backing the victims' voices and urging the Japanese government to hear them. Rallies are scheduled in 34 cities in 10 countries, including the UK, New Zealand, the Philippines, Taiwan and Japan, to show global solidarity.
So this rally continued until today and will continue.
Now,
and also the problem framed up again because this comfort women statue first installed in Seoul in 2011 in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul. And after this statue was built, so finally, so the two governments tried to solve the issue and comfort women agreement between the two governments. So in 2015, and what the content of the agreement. So the agreement commits Japan to provide 1 billion to South Korean fund for the purpose of compensating the former comfort women, the victims. So while it urged Korea to strive to solve the comfort women statue in Seoul in an appropriate manner, it's quite an vague term, appropriate manner. The two governments so hereby agreed to resolve the comfort women issue finally and irreversibly. But this agreement shows the limits of governmental initiatives to solve the comfort women issue. Actually, so after the agreement, so this agreement sparked anger among comfort women supporters. So these supporters insisted that the Korean government has no authority to remove a statue elected by private citizens. So there's some gap between the Korean citizens and the Korean government. Korean government tried to improve the diplomatic relation with Japan, but this agreement sparked anger among Korean comfort women supporters and also Korean citizens in general. So even after this agreement in 2015, comfort women statue continued to build in Busan, and each time this comfort women statue is elected within South Korea, always we saw diplomatic controversy like this. So each time this statue, Comfort Women statue is erected, so we have seen numerously this kind of diplomatic controversy. So this is my suggestion and perspectives. So maybe towards solving this issue and more generally historical reconciliation between Japan and South Korea, we have to look at some search for a new dimension of this issue. So I think so currently the comfort of women issue is perceived as diplomatic problem between the two governments, but we have to broaden our view and we have to look at more universal aspect of this issue, human rights problem aspect. So let me introduce the universalization of this issue. So now this issue is no longer so narrowly defined diplomatic issue, but so this problem gained some universality. For example, the South Korea new gender equality and family minister Chung Hyun Bak, so she say so-called comfort women issue is no longer an issue between South Korea and Japan, but an international one, universal one. And actually, so when the first comfort women spoke out in South Korea, so also the world, the global attitude towards sexual violence had changed drastically. So in 1990s, so there's a conflict in former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda, and we have seen the large scale of sexual violence in these conflict. So after the conflict, International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, for Rwanda were created. And finally, so now we have the permanent International Criminal Court. So ICC, so they prosecuted rape as a war crime and also crime against humanity. So rape is now recognized, finally recognized as a crime against humanity. So this kind of the norm change is quite important when we look at and try to understand the comfort women issue. So the renewed attention to the comfort women issue is not purely so their driving force did not come from South Korea or from East Asia, but this kind of global shift in attitude towards sexual violence had a huge effect, huge influence on this change. And also, so now UN Human Rights Committee has numerously emphasized this issue is an issue of universal human rights issue. That's why UN Human Rights Committee have interest in this issue. So she's Nabi Pillay, High Commissioner for Human Rights. So she also emphasized this is a human rights issue. That's why not only South Korean and the Japanese, but everyone should be interested in this issue. And so comfort women statue continue to be built, not only within South Korea, but now literally all over the world. So in California, Glendale, and San Francisco. And in San Francisco, these statues, so they symbolize, so they represent Korean lady, also Chinese lady, Filipino lady. So it's show the universalization of this issue. And also Manila had the state statue, Comfort Women statue in 2017, but it caused diplomatic tension between Filipino government and the Japanese government. So,
Japan has expressed regret following the Philippines' recent unveiling of a statue representing the so-called comfort women. In a press briefing Tuesday, Japan's Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga said that Japan regrets any country installing a comfort woman statue, adding that it'll decide how to react through communications with the Philippine government. On Friday, the League of Filipino Women and the National Historical Commission of the Philippines jointly unveiled the 2-meter-tall statue to honor some 1,000 Filipino victims who were forced into sexual slavery by Japanese soldiers during World War II. The Philippine government said it would not take any position on the comfort woman issue, hoping that the statue would not affect Manila-Tokyo relations.
So we can know from this that the Japanese government see the comfort women issue as quite narrowly defined diplomatic issue. So each time the comfort women statue is built, so they offer some this kind of regret feeling. They show regret feeling, and they even give pressure to the government. So, and in Japan also there's some incident. So this statue, Comfort Women statue, was installed at Aichi Triennale International Art Festival in 2019. But this statue sparked criticism and even intimidation from right-wingers. So see.
Back in August, the Japanese government played a part in pressuring a major international art festival to remove a statue representing the victims of the country's wartime sexual slavery. Finally, it is back in the spotlight and will stay there until the Aichi Triennale ends next Monday. Ji-young has the full story.
Following threats from ultra-right Japanese protesters and pressure from the Japanese government, the statue representing the so-called comfort women was abruptly removed from the Aichi Triennale just 3 days after the festival's opening 2 months ago. But the exhibition featuring the statue reopened Tuesday afternoon and will stay open until the end of the festival on October 14th. Still, there are strict limitations on viewing which have been widely denounced. Only 30 people are allowed at a time, and they have to reserve a spot ahead of time. They also have to go through a bag inspection and a metal detector. They're accompanied by a guide and are not allowed to take pictures or post them online. More than 700 people have applied for a spot to see the Comfort Woman statue, but the Japanese government is still strongly opposed to being it on display. According to Kyodo News, the mayor of Nagoya, the city hosting the festival, said Tuesday morning after visiting that its display is violence to hijack public opinion in the name of freedom of expression.
So now, a lot of Japanese are wondering if the freedom of expression still exists in Japan. So we are not only artists, but the Japanese people in general are seriously wonder after this incident in Aichi Triennale. So this exhibition titled After Freedom of Expression. So this exhibition aimed at questioning freedom, the status of freedom of expression in Japan, because a lot of not censorship, but the soft kind of censorship actually is now prevailing in Japan. So the artists try to question the current status of Japanese society and still freedom of expression exists or not. But this exhibition was canceled after only 3 days because of numerous threatening phone calls over the Statue of Peace symbolizing wartime comfort women. And also the Japanese government intervened. They also threatened to withhold planned subsidies for this art festival. So finally, they gave less amount of money, but the government, we saw the governmental intervention in the art festival. So it's quite unusual. And also not only right-wingers, but actually a lot of Japanese people opposed to the statue. So 74.9% of Japanese people, they oppose to the installation of the comfort women. Maybe the reason should be quite diverse, but so if we just look at the number, the majority of people oppose to the statue. This is the status of our society now. And but still the comfort of women's statue is spreading. So now in Berlin, so they have the comfort of women's statue. So even after Japanese government opposition, so they decided to continue to install this statue. So how can we broaden the conversation comfort women and sexual violence? So for example, so let me introduce Korea. So now we have seen the comfort women statue and so Korean people's anger towards the sexual violence by Japanese soldiers during World War II. But now in Korea, there emerges some self-reflection of their role as perpetrator in Vietnam War. For example, she is a rape survivor by Korean soldiers in Vietnam War.
Tên là Nguyễn Thị Bạch Tuyết, 60 tuổi. Thị trấn Phú Túc, huyện Krông Ba, tỉnh Gia Lai. Hồi lính Hàn Quốc là tôi ở Phù Cát chứ không phải ở đây. Nhà ở Phù Cát. Ở Phù Cát là coi như là thôn Kiều An, xã Cát Trinh, huyện Phù Cát, tỉnh Bình Định. Là hồi đấy là nhà là ở đó, mà gần cái bãi rác, nhà tôi ở là gần cái bãi rác của Hàn Quốc nó đổ. Rồi là nhà đấy là có bán dừa quả với lại chuối rồi nước mà, là gần cái bãi rác họ đi qua đấy là rồi họ đổ rác xong rồi họ ngừng đấy là họ uống nước. Hồi cái đồn để hàng đấy là nó đóng ở gần nhà tôi, là nó đóng tôi biết chỗ luôn á, ở ngay Gò Dõng á. Ở đấy là kêu là cái chỗ là ngay cái địa bàn của nó là Phù Cát rồi ăn á, mà nó đóng ngay cái chỗ Gò Dõng, là chỗ đây nó kêu là sư đoàn Mãnh Hổ. Má đấy là hồi đấy là nhà có bán nước á, bán dừa đó, rồi họ đi đổ rác, họ tới ngừng đấy họ uống sao không biết. Rồi hồi tôi cũng còn nhỏ, tôi cũng mong đĩ đi chơi cũng hỏi, rồi cái thấy người Hàn Quốc cái vô hiếp dâm bả, rồi sau này không biết vợ chồng về kình cãi rồi ông bỏ bả, ông đi luôn. Rồi người đấy đi đâu mất mình đâu có biết đâu, không biết. Đẻ thằng con năm số 9. Bản thân là coi như là cũng như là nhà là cũng bán nước, hồi tôi còn nhỏ tôi cũng chưa biết gì hết á, chưa biết yêu đương, chưa biết gì hết đâu. Rồi họ tới thì uống nước trong khi ra nhà đó là em nó còn nhỏ hết à, hồi đây em nhỏ nhất mà đâu có đứa nào.
Finally, Vietnamese lady raped by Korean soldier spoke out like Korean comfort women, former comfort women spoke out in 1990s. So so we have seen this kind of artistic like how to say, so Korean self-regulation on sexual violence during the Vietnam War. So let me introduce the important ones of Vietnam Theater. So this statue is installed in Da Nang. So it's interesting because this Vietnam Theater was created by Mr. and Mrs. Kim there. So couple, so the same creator of Comfort Women statue in the front of Japanese embassy in Seoul. So they created the Vietnam Theater and also the Comfort Women statue. And they say, so there is some same spirit. So these Mr. and Mrs. Kim say, we created Vietnam Theater because the South Korean government must demand and it must receive an exact apology from the Japanese government about the issue of the former Korean comfort women. But they also emphasize, it must make an exact apology for the massacre of civilians during the Vietnam War by Korean soldiers. So because their scope is universal, so that's why they are quite critical toward Japan's government and the sexual violence by Japanese soldiers during World War II. But following the same spirit, so they criticize Korean government for not have apologized to Vietnamese government, and also Korean soldiers who raped violently Vietnamese ladies and killed a lot of Vietnamese civilians. So the Comfort Women statue is quite famous, is well known, but this Vietnam Peter is not so much not well known still. So, but still, so the number is small, but this Vietnam Peter is also even slowly spreading. For example, Jeju Island, so quite famous island as a island of peace, they have Vietnam Peter several years ago. あ、ちょっとあれ、これはちょっと、あれ、ちょっと今のはちょっとスキップされた。 So, and so this is a first part, so I spend a lot of time for this, but this is a part of the historical part. But so the next section, so let me introduce the current gender status in Japan and why we cannot understand comfort women problem properly. I think frankly, still gender equality is not achieved in Japan in many senses. So this really affect our perception of comfort women issue. So let me introduce and show some examples and persistent discrimination towards sex workers and rape victims in contemporary Japan to understand further what perception of comfort women issue. So for example, we saw clear discrimination against sex workers even during COVID-19. So Japanese government surprisingly excluded sex business companies from government aid programs, though they are the most vulnerable members of society during the COVID-19. And the Health Ministry of Japan, so they justified this discrimination, exclusion, saying that in the past, these sex industries had some tie with crime syndicates. So they tied these sex workers and sex industry with criminality. And also, so rape victims in Japan, so they have had a bashing criticism, and even they had to have stigma. So Shiori Ito is quite famous thanks to BBC documentary focusing on her rape case. So let me introduce.
I became one of the victims for the first time and experienced how small my voice is.
It's now been 3 years since Shiori Ito says she was raped by a prominent journalist. They met over dinner in Tokyo while Shiori was an intern looking for work. She says the last thing she remembers was going to the bathroom feeling dizzy, then waking up in a strange hotel room. She thinks she was drugged.
I woke up with this intense pain, and when I woke up, he was on top of me and penetrating, and that's how I found out. And yeah, he was raping me.
Shiori's alleged attacker denied raping her. He was never arrested and the case was dropped. Shiori says prosecutors cited lack of evidence, despite her claim of CCTV footage, witness statements, and DNA supporting her allegations. We reached out to the prosecutor's office for comment and were told they can't speak about individual cases. Statistically, Japan appears to have low rates of sexual assault compared to the US and the UK. However, only 4% of rape victims actually file a report, according to the Cabinet Office of the central government. So that number is likely to be much higher. Part of the problem is Japan's rape law. A prosecutor...
So, as this CNN says, only small rape victim filed a case in Japan. So it is actually surprising that Ito's rape case was first featured on BBC, not on Japanese media. So Japanese media had been long silent on this issue. So Ito alleged that in 2017, she was raped by quite well-known TV journalist Yamaguchi, and he was a biographer of Japanese then Prime Minister Abe. So we suspect that some political pressure was directed on Shiori Ito, and the Japanese media hesitated to report this issue because of the political pressure. So, but after that, after she alleged Shiori Ito was met with hate mail and public humiliation from right-wingers, and finally she had to move. So now she lives in UK, and also prosecutors declined to pursue this case in criminal court. She had to pursue a civil case against Yamaguchi. So a lot of problem during the process. And so why has it become so hard to prosecute rape case? So I have to point out, Japan has quite outdated Japanese criminal justice. It's not as if this law is quite outdated. For example, until 2017, Japan maintained the so-called penal code passed in almost 100 years ago. So this code stipulated that rape must involve intimidation, violence, or manipulation victim status of mind. Also, a victim is required to prove that they actively resisted to launch a successful case. So it's so challenging. It's so hard for rape victim to prove there was intimidation, there was violence, and I resisted actively. It is almost impossible for rape victims to prove these things. And this law, until 2017, still the Japanese law had this code. So after finally this bill was amended, but still so this active resistance requirement, it was maintained. We still have this. So finally, I spent a lot of time, but finally, let me introduce some signs for change. So after that, we have seen flower demo against sexual violence. So Me Too movement in Japan, and also with you solidarity among women sexual violence victims. So because there was a very shocking case in 2019, a court found that a father had raped his 90-year-old daughter. But so the court say because it couldn't decide if she had resisted, so the court did not convict the father. So this case sparked anger among Japanese citizens. So after that, so every 11th of day of every month, so there was a gathering flower demo toward gender equal society and abolishment of sexual violence. So there's some pictures, so and the ladies, but there's of course not only ladies, but several men also join this rally, and they are listening to the stories of rape victims. And so she has a Me Too with You Flower Demo flyer. And also Shiori Ito joined the one rally and share her story with participants. And finally, so civil case, Ito won finally, and so 3.3 million yen for her damages. But so of course, not only the amount of money, so she already won. So the factor is the most important. And so finally, so let me introduce the general situation of the gender about surrounding the Japanese females. For example, the very recent report about gender gap, Japan ranked 120th out of 156 countries. And especially political empowerment, economic participation. So about these two, Japan is far behind the international standard. So this is a graph of the Japanese gender gap. So economy, politics, so far behind the standard average, and political challenges. For example, about the Diet Lower House members, just 10% we have female Congress, female member, only 10%. And if we look at ministerial positions, again, just 10%. And Japan has never had a female prime minister. And for example, so the picture is very interesting. So which is a Japanese ministers? So it's a very clear. So for example, the Suga cabinet, only one female cabinet member, but the other countries, so even female prime minister and a lot of diversity. So and men and women, and even more, not only men and women, some transgender and LGBT. So the world is becoming diverse, but about the political situation in Japan, so where the time stop in Japan. And so very recently, so Tokyo Olympic Games, it's supposed to come this summer. So Yoshiro Mori, the former Tokyo Olympic chief, finally stepped down because of sexist remark. He said, women talk too much, and that meeting with many female board directors would take a lot of time. So not only Mr. Mori, but there are a lot of people still have this kind of gender discriminating ideas. So, and they exclude females for this kind of reason. And also, so this is also very shocking, not only in Japan, but internationally. So scandal in Japan. So Tokyo Medical University restricted number of female doctors. So let me introduce a demonstration against this.
Well, it's time now on the programme for our focus report, and today we're heading to Tokyo. For the past 12 years, the prestigious medical university there held secret quotas against women to restrict the numbers of female doctors joining the profession. The scandal reveals a deep-seated bias against employing mothers in Japan, as our team on the ground have been finding out.
A scandal that shook Japan and revealed a deep-seated discrimination against women. The most prestigious medical school in Japan, Tokyo Medical University, has admitted that since 2006, it has been secretly decreasing the marks scored by female candidates at its entrance exam. Behind this manipulation, a desire to restrict the number of women doctors as they are likely to stop working when they become mothers.
Okay, so what factors was behind this restriction? So there are so many reasons, but so one thing is that there's quite still very strong patriarchal norms, traditional roles of the husband as breadwinner and the wife as homemaker. This kind of idea in Japan still remain quite strong. And some people, and a quite significant number of people, think that the restriction is justified. So, and the incident itself, the restriction itself is also very shocking, but it's also shocking that a lot of people think that the restriction is justified because they have still this kind of idea. So this kind of idea is quite strong still today, and the employment rate for women with children less than 3 years old is only 30%, so far behind average for OECD countries. And also Japan ranked 28th out of 29, almost the bottom, major country in terms of the environment of working women. So according to the Economist magazine, so I introduced this, so Japan is quite low, the ranking is quite low, but the Turkey is, according to economists, the situation is almost similar. Turkey is 27th. So there are some similarities between the two countries. So I hope that we can discuss later at the discussion section. And also culture, so I spent a lot of time, but finally, briefly, let me introduce some cultural factors. Female objectification in Japanese media. For example, NHK, so the Japan Broadcasting Corporation. So this is the official character of NHK. So yeah, actually this kind of overtly sexualized images of teenagers is quite prevailing in Japan. But the international society, so nowadays quite bitterly criticized this is the female objectification and overtly sexual images. So there's some gap between Japan and the international society. And also within Japan, so increasing number of people are there say this kind of images are not acceptable. So we see some gap and conflict within Japan as well. But this, for example, the Japanese Red Cross, so they use this kind of image. So over sexualized. So there was a controversy. So some people say this is a freedom of expression, and also this is not a real character. So they are visual, they are virtual. So it's okay, but so the other people, so this is this kind of image contribute to gender discrimination. So we have to stop. So the controversy still goes on. And so Japanese idols, so they are teenagers, this kind of quite sexy images is still prevailing in the train, in the cities. And so AKB, for example, they quite, nowadays they are not that much popular, but they are quite popular.
1, 2, 3, 4. This is the sound of Japanese pop success. I want you. AKB.
For example, this is a CNN. So CNN.
Hit number 1.
For example, CNN anchor. So
The songs, and some of them have been criticised for being overtly sexual. Critics say that they're filled with double meanings, sexual meanings, and that the girls who are performing are teenagers, some as young as 13 and 14 years of age. What is your response to this criticism?
批判はないですね。
There is no criticism. The lyrics are used as metaphors. The most important thing is not to hide, but rather how to convey. I was often asked how someone...
So the producers say this is not sexism, but the now international criticism is increasing and mounting. So for example, this is from BBC.
This is Akihabara in Tokyo, and in this neighborhood there are lots and lots of shops that specialize in selling manga. So what is manga? Well, it's a very Japanese art form. It's really graphic novels or animated storybooks that are direct. This is manga. So what is manga? Well, it's a very Japanese art form. It's really graphic novels or animated storybooks that are directed not at children, but at adults. And it is very, very popular in Japan, and there are dozens and dozens of different genres of manga. And those include manga pornography and child porn. So I'm going to go in here and see what I can find. Inside here is a huge variety of manga porn openly on display, including stuff like this. Now, you can see from the outside cover, this is clearly a child, and I'm obviously not going to show you what is inside it, but I can tell you it depicts multiple scenes of the child character being raped. Material like this would be illegal in many countries, including the United States and Britain. It's not illegal here, and it's going to remain legal despite this new legislation, as are video games and cartoons also depicting this sort of child pornography. The argument made here in Japan is that there are no victims, real human victims of this sort of material, and it is a matter of free speech. But it's also clearly about money. The manga industry in Japan is huge, and the publishers don't want any restrictions on what they...
So now the gap between Japan and the international society has been widening. So he clearly say this is manga porno, but the defender of manga, this is just virtual, and there's no big real victims. So that's why it is justified. So finally, so let me summarize and let me, there's some, of course, I'm very happy to have your questions, but there are several points and possible questions. For example, what is your view on wartime comfort women issue, and how can Japanese and Koreans move forward toward reconciliation and improved relations? And so how gender situations are different or similar between Japan and Turkey? So how can we improve the gender situation toward a more gender equal society? And also, finally, I introduced several animes and Japanese idol culture. So how do you think of this kind of anime and Japanese idol culture? They are just objectification of female or freedom of expression and the effect on the gender and the society in Japan. So, but they are just possible questions, and I'm very happy to have your question. Any question? So thank you. So I spend a lot of time because the topic, there's so many topics to discuss about gender in Japan. So sorry for long presentation, but thank you for listening.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Mimaki. Like she said, this is a huge and multifaceted question. So it's amazing that she could still summarize all this within 1 hour. But with that, so we will unmute everybody. So either if you have any questions, you can either speak up on your microphone, or you can use the chat or Q&A function. So do we have any questions? or comments. Maybe while people are thinking, okay, maybe we have somebody who raised their hand. Do we have, okay, Brock, please go ahead.
Okay. So I'm glad to see Seiko here after all these years, my dear friends. And this is a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. And you actually made like 2 or 3 different even presentations. Like, of course, they are all related to gender issues, but it's very dense and very informative. So I have one just question as a starter. You talked about the very weak political representation of women in Japan, again, which is quite similar to the situation in Turkey. But my interest is, there is a growing, rising sort of a right-wing politics in Japan, right? Even flirting with far right. That, for example, the clip that you showed with regard to attacks against Koreans and so on and so forth. So can you elaborate a little bit on the relationship between the rise of the political right and the gender problems in contemporary Japan? And the second is, are there any political parties, or what are the political parties that sort of engage with the feminist movement in Japan and try to raise the demands of women in Japanese politics? Like, which political parties? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for very important question. Yes, it's very important and difficult. So today I showed the anti-Korean rally, and there I admit that there are several the significant number of these right wingers in Japan. But now the ruling party, Liberal Democratic Party, it's not so this kind of very radical right wingers, the number is not so huge. So they are core supporter of the ruling party, but the number is not so large. So now people quite passively support LDP, the ruling party. So a lot of people say there's no alternatives because the opposition party is too weak. So they try to propose something new, but the opposition party, the number of their seats are too few to have influence. So the overall political situation is not healthy. So the ruling party is too strong. And so their policy, for example, the policy to combat with the pandemic, their pandemic policy is so awful. And why having Olympic game this summer is a stupid idea, but still the ruling party is widely supported. Even the numbers are a little bit declining, but still they have strong support. So sorry, I am not answering to your question directly, but the political apathy, or this kind of thing is the biggest problem in Japan. So, and I see in the society, so we are, especially young people are becoming liberal and progressive. And for example, the same-sex marriage and gender equality, LGBT rights. So the young people and people are generally they are becoming progressive, and they embrace these liberal values. But still, so the same person support LDP because there was an opposition party. They cannot rely on opposition party. Only LDP is option they believe. So political situation and societal situation, it's a little bit there's a like difference. So people are discontent. People are not satisfied with the current politics, but that's not lead. So they have some belief or they still support LDP. So this paradoxical situation is, yeah, this is a very frank situation in Japan. So, but thank you for your question.
Yeah, Japan is a very strange politically, because basically it's like a one-party rule, and people tend to vote to that party because that's all they really know, and they're quite ambiguous about other. Of course, other parties do exist, but majority seem to vote to the major party by default. So I think that's part of a much larger issue here. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A box. Can you see it? First, we have from Edu. She says, thank you for the presentation. How do Japanese women view the comfort women's issue and the Japanese government's approach to this issue? So
yes, it's very important when we try to understand the comfort of women issue. So usually, so as a woman, and so Japanese women should have more sympathy towards Korean former comfort women and rape victims. But very unfortunately, now this kind of feminist type, feminism solidarity, conflict with nationalism here. So sometimes, so their anger, so their hate towards, their antipathy towards Korea, so it's more this, they're overwhelmed. So this kind of feminist ties. So, but I think, yes, comfort women issues are quite difficult because this kind of feminism, gender issue, conflict with nationalistic antagonism between the two countries. So thank you for your insight and perspective. But generally, so Japanese females do not sympathize with Korean comfort women. They are sympathize, for example, they joined flower demo, but I'm not so sure these participants in flower demo toward against sexual violence have sympathy with Korean comfort women. So there's some very problematic nationalism is prevailing in Japan. So thank you for your perspective. And the second question.
I'm sorry.
Gokcha, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I thought she was reading another question. Otherwise, yes, I do have a few questions. So thank you very much, first of all. This was really fascinating. I would like to ask, recently a law professor at Harvard University has raised his opinion on this issue, and it triggered a huge debate. And I would like to hear your perspective on this this debate. Mark Ramseyer said that those comfort women were prostitutes, and he made comments about that, not in the line with they should not be perceived as having the so-called equal. It's hard to frame it for me, even having equal stance with women who are not prostitutes, maybe, or maybe you can frame it in a better way. And it triggered a huge chains of reactions from feminist scholars of Japan, and then those feminist scholars, international scholars, were being attacked by some right-wing people from Japan. I wonder, what you would say about this, and then is there any solidarity between Japanese feminists with these scholars, with these international scholars? Have you been observing that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for each question is quite critical and very important. Yeah, today I didn't mention Lam Zayer, Harvard professor Lam Zayer's article, so which insisted that they are not comfort women or sex slaves, but they are prostitutes. They get money for sexual service and it is just, for example, my friends, scholars, historians, so they wrote a quite comprehensive answer to show that the historical, they are not the Lam Zayer article. For example, this article is morally wrong, but also if it is not based on the documents, historical documents, and in many senses, so it is wrong, morally wrong, so academically wrong. And finally, the journals, so they decided not to publish his article. Yes, sir. So, but from Japanese perspective, so this Harvard professor and Harvard professor have the quite friendly relationship with the Japanese government, and the professor is his position is funded by at least partly by the Japanese government. And of course, we suspect that so Japanese government, not directly, but some push the professor to write this kind of article. And yes, but from the Japanese perspectives, so this overall the Lam Zayer article and subsequent debate, not so many Japanese is interested in this issue. So I'm wondering, and one thing that I'm worried is, so we have to, because comfort women issue is a human rights issue and human rights issue, and everyone should be interested in this issue, and especially young people is encouraged to be interested in this issue. But very sadly, so now the Japanese society, not so many people, only right-wingers and progressive historians, only they are interested in this issue and join the debates. So I think, and I try to broaden the scope of this issue and try to include so more ordinary citizens to the discussion. So in this sense, so Lam Zayer article, it's a little bit too academic debates, and not so many ordinary people can follow. So of course, the issue itself is important. But for example, that in order to elaborate and spread the debates among ordinary citizens, I think the comfort women statue that I introduced today and the Vietnam theater, which symbolize South Korean self-reflection on their perpetrator side. This kind of statue is a maybe more better, like the starting point for discussion for the ordinary citizens. But it does not mean that the Lam Zayer article is not important. And I hope that the Japanese should have more debates over on the article. And the other question, I have answered to it.
No, so I was wondering if the extent of solidarity between Japanese activists or the scholars. I was actually a student of Professor Inoue, Professor Ueno Chizuko.
Really? So you okay? Yes, yeah. Chizuko Ueno is one of the most famous and prestigious feminist scholar in Japan. Yeah, but so I am not if Ueno is a feminist scholar, I cannot say I am a feminist scholar. I'm not. So my expertise is diplomatic history, but I think that one problem of Japanese female. For example, the Ueno discuss comfort women issue a lot. So she has many articles, but the more new generation of feminist scholars, it's not intentionally, but they hesitate to discuss comfort women issue because it sparked anger and emotional reaction from right wingers. So they are more focus on the, for example, this kind. Today I introduced several anime and this kind of sexual opposites in media, how media describe the female, this kind of thing. So the younger generation more focus on this kind of more, how to say, not the problematic things. So, and the comfort women, I hope that not only feminist scholar, but more historians should discuss more frankly and with solidarity with Korean scholar, we have to have more discussion. But unfortunately, currently, the Japanese feminist scholars, unlike Ueno, so they more domestically, their focus is more domestic. So I think your point is quite important. We have to broaden our eyes and our scope more internationally. And yes, thank you.
I have one more question, if that's okay. If there are other questions, I would like to let them ask first, since I already asked the question.
Maybe we have two more questions in the Q&A box. Maybe we can address those first.
Please.
Because I think they're kind of related to what we've been talking about.
Sure, please.
The first one by Reshad is about a security community in Northeast Asia.
Yes, it's a very important perspective because so in between Japan and South Korea, we have always historical disputes. So shared interest in security, especially against North Korea, can be a starting point toward improved relation between South Korea and Japan. But now, so Moon Jae-in government, so they are, he tried to improve the relation with North Korea, and they prefer having conversation with North Korea than with Japan. So this kind of security interest is now not overlapping. So this is one of the difficulty of improving the diplomatic relations. So we have a historical dispute and our security interest is not overlapping. And also about economic relations. It's not now, so Korean company, it's more, they try to be independent from Japanese company. So they try to be, so now, so it's a very fundamental perspective. So now historical dispute, security, we do not have shared security interest, economic relations declining. So there's no like stable basis toward improved relations. So yes, so this is a status, but I will continue to think this perspective. Thank you.
And also from Yellen, I think it's something in relation to the pandemic too.
Yes. Yes, so for example, that we have the word C-session. So a lot of women, so they lost a job. So there's a clear gender inequality. So of course, a lot of people lost their job, but if we look at the gender gap, apparently more women lost a job. So yes, this is a very, but not only in Japan, but this happens, C-session. So happens not only in Japan, but quite internationally in the other countries as well. And Yes, so the situation, yeah, during the pandemic, so the situation, yeah, clearly deteriorated. But I think the people in general are quite suffering. But because the government is more interested in having Olympic game this summer rather than in saving vulnerables and people who are suffering. So this is a general situation in Japan. And of course, we always look at the gender discrimination and the gender gap. Everyone is suffering, but females are more suffering. But the overall situation are quite tough in Japan. A lot of company, so they bankrupted, and people are, especially artists and the theater. So this kind of people are quite suffering, and so yes. So I'm maybe my answer is not so clear, but yes, the situation deteriorated, and it's very important perspective. Thank you.
And I would also add that in the case of Japan, I think part of the issue here is that the majority of female workers are part-time workers, right? And therefore they are more vulnerable and therefore more affected by the pandemic. So I think that might be especially in the case of Japan. So I think, so Gökçe, you can go ahead for your other question.
So yes, when thinking about the international responses in the international platform, you mentioned the Filipino government, and you said it wasn't clear to me. You said Japanese government expressed regret to Philippines, or was it a regret or resentment?
About comfort women statue?
Yes.
In Japanese, ikan.
Oh, okay.
You know, the ikan is quite a bad word. So Japanese people frequently use the word of ikan, and it's so, yes, regret. But so it's some.
Yeah, I was the hierarchy, so it's now clear that, you know, because it's known, you know, Japan's attitude in the international platforms in terms of, you know, the imperial history and the hierarchy of foreignness is known. So I was wondering, you know, how that's really reflected with Filipino. But ikan is also still, I think, a more diplomatic language, so it doesn't openly reveal it. It's yeah.
I think that, for example, last year, the new statue was built in Berlin. So, but so it's very complicated because the statue is built by private citizens. So it's actually so weird that why Japanese government criticize and so even criticize to the toward the Filipino government, because the statue was elected by private citizens. So many confusion about comfort women's statue can be seen in governmental attitude. So I generally, of course, I oppose, and I think this is a stupid idea to try to remove the statue elected by private citizens to commemorate rape victims. So if Japan says, so we evaluate human rights issues, so we have to appreciate these statues. Of course, there's several sensitive points about comfort women's statue, I admit, but generally, so this statue, it's not, of course, this is the intention is, one intention is to criticize Japanese government and Japanese wrongdoing during the war, but also it's try to promote female rights and it, so like the movement towards society, the world without sexual violence. So I think the Japanese government should be more open and should understand the general trend about the female rights and human rights. So thank you for your very good question.
Yeah, I think she pointed out an important point where Japanese politicians like to use that word, right? Ikan, like that kind of regret. But the issue is who regret for what, right? Regret, you might think, oh, is it a regret for this history of, having like used comfort woman? But in reality, what the regret was that the regret for having somebody create this statue, right? That's the regret that the politicians are talking about, not about the fact that there were comfort women, right?
It's not directly indexing the act as I understand it. It's not really indexing something, it's more open statement of, I think it's perfect diplomatic language.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Japanese diplomatic language is so even for Japanese, sometimes a little bit hard to understand why they use the word. Ikan is I think I dislike the word of ikan. So when they use ikan, so they do not want to apologize. So ikan is like quite politicians quite conveniently use this term. And about the terminology, for example, today I use the word of comfort women, but so for example the word at the United Nations and the Korean people, so they use more direct word of sex slaves. So and so sorry, so but today I use a comfort women, but yes, comfort, they're using comfort women, it's sometimes like more, how to say, 難しいな、more like
it's like
not,
a euphemism, right?
yes, so criticize for like this. So but this is not my intention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is because, it is a word that is widely adopted, at least in the Japanese context, as a very euphemistic way of describing these women. But in essence, they were sexual slavery.
Yes.
So I do have one quick question to wrap up everything, touching on some of the main issues that we discussed so far. And I think the main issue here is that, especially from the Japanese side, from the perspective of the Japanese government, they only see this as a historical issue, diplomatic issue, and very sensitive about that. And that also links to the historical narrative that Japan produces. And this comfort woman issue is also connected with another huge debate that took place in Japan since the 1990s about this historical representation in school textbooks. And there's been a huge debate of whether to include the reference on comfort woman in school textbooks. And at one point they started to include, in the 1990s, around the time when some politicians acknowledged the system. But with more conservative backlash, that reference to comfort woman has been erased. So I'm wondering what kind of impact that might have on young people, Japanese. What are the perspectives of the young people about the comfort woman issue?
Yeah, it's very important and long-term influence. So the Japanese textbook is not national one. There are several options and a lot of companies, and there's a standard. And once the textbook meets the standards, they can publish, and each school choose this. Yes, but now again, like academia, so textbook publishers, so they hesitate to include the detail of the comfort women, because once they include definitely they have some phone calls or letters from right wingers. So yeah, very frankly, it is quite not healthy. It is quite unhealthy situation. So we have to discuss and to understand more. But in political situation generally, so do not allow us to do so. Yes, several textbook publishers, so historical ones, so because they have pride of being progressive in long time for a long time, so they continue to publish which have details of the comfort women. But I think that newer publishers they hesitate to include the detail of the comfort women. For example, that we have the Japanese government and the Korean government have a dispute of the exact number of comfort women. So that means that we cannot have the number of the scale of the comfort women. So the several textbooks still have the details of comfort women, but from the historian's perspective, it is not enough. And it just a fact, we have to more moral questions related to the comfort women, but almost no textbook have this kind of more detail and critical thinking about comfort women. So I think this, so yeah, I teach at the university and as an occasion, I feel that the young people, they are not like, they are not right wingers. They do not have antipathy towards Korea, or they have even sympathy through the culture towards Korea, but I see their ignorance and they are not interested in history, not only comfort women or more generally, but especially this kind of controversial issue. So I think their ignorance have long, because Korean people are quite interested in it, there's a quite a gap. So they are very interested in it, but Japanese people lose their interest in this issue. I think this should have long-term influence. I will think about that. Thank you for that. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
One last question. If we are running out of time, that's fine. I can send her an email.
So as long as Dr. Mimaki is okay, you can do it.
Okay.
So thank you. I'm curious about the grassroots movement as a reaction to all of these forms of discrimination you've been explaining. Because when I was doing research, I witnessed in various forms that how much ingrained it is in the society. My research was with the Rakugo performers. You may remember from me from. Oh yes.
We met.
Yes.
Extra. Wow. Okay. Okay. Wow.
So when I was apprenticing under a Rakugo performer, he was very open to me about this.
Yes.
And part of my research is about gender in Rakugo because it's a very male-dominated community. And as I pushed the boundaries in various ways, and I was asking them, what would happen if they had an increased number of women in the community, and what are and asking the circumstances that women had to bear with, and he told me openly that in many other for other reasons too, that he insisted that this is not a democratic community, the community of Rakugo performers. He emphasized that it's not a democratic community, so that whoever agrees to be a part of that community has to, it means that they already accept the circumstances they're going to meet there, including harassment. So this is our community. He was saying this is how people behave, and whoever this, and there are other forms of strict hierarchy in the community. So whoever wants to participate in our community means that they already accept the circumstances. So
it's not acceptable in Japan. So I think there's still the, for example, Me Too movement. I have to admit that it is not so strong. For example, if we look at several years ago, the Korean society and Japanese society, the two society is quite a gender discriminating society, but the speed of change of Korean society is much higher. They are more speedy. So, for example, now Seoul National University has 40% of female students. But compared with Seoul National University, Seoul University, for example, Tokyo University, only 20% of female students. How much, for example, the Turkish University, Tokyo University, like university have, what's the percentage of female students?
I don't know a percentage, but
I think they're but higher than 20%.
I can't give you numbers, but you know, the discrimination is not only about quantities, so there are other scales, major scales at work, but maybe another person can answer the question about numbers.
But for example, yes, but I think that so now, so especially about after Mori's, the former Olympic Committee, Mori's sexist remark, I think that now we are finally be aware and how we are far behind the international standard about the gender. For example, this kind of statement. So you have to, this is not a democratic society and the woman should be, this kind of statement, it's no longer acceptable in Japanese society. So this happened several years ago, I think. So you are in Japan.
Rakugo, he said it for the community of Rakugo performers. He said it, orera no sekai, he was saying, you know, but he was referring to the community of Rakugo performers.
But for example, like Rakugo, Japanese comedy, it's quite gender discriminating. But nowadays, especially younger generation, they feel that they cannot accept, even it was fun for several years ago. But nowadays, so like gender discriminating comedy, so young people they do not enjoy. So I see that's why. So nowadays, young people in Japan, they are more interested in Netflix or Korean drama, Korean pop culture. Yeah, there are of course several reasons, but I think more these contents are more gender progressive. So Japanese media, Japanese contents, from gender perspective, they are not that much progressive, but the young people prefer international progressive content. So I see several positive signs in younger generation. I hope.
I was asking the grassroots movement because speaking of that reporter who was raped, there was she had to face a lot of criticism from public and from women who were openly saying that, oh, because her shirt was the collar was too open, or you know, they were criticizing her attitude, her outfit, or things like that, which happens in a lot of other places too.
Yes, but yes, but finally she won, and I think during her trial itself actually changed the Japanese society. Of course, this kind of people criticizing Shiori Ito, so this kind of person still exist here, but they cannot vocal no longer. So I hope that yes, the Japanese society move toward more gender equal society. So and Ito's trial, I think it contributed a lot to this change.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that international pressure is pretty much the key in terms of changing the gender attitudes in Japan. And I think that was illustrated in that recent controversy over the Olympic Committee Chief Mori's remarks. And after that, the response was pretty quick, right? It seems like there were a lot of criticisms from the public about his remarks. And that was also partly because of his status as an international, whatever remarks he made became international headline, and his sexist remarks became like a national disgrace of how backward Japan was in terms of the in terms of gender situations. So that kind of international pressure might help help create this urgency and awareness among the Japanese public as well. So if we don't have further comments, I think we can start wrapping up. And so thank you again for Dr. Mimaki. I truly respect your work for tackling some of these very difficult issues in Japan, and it's easier for me to say things abroad, but I always feel that it's much more difficult to work on these issues inside Japan. So I have very much deep respect for her work, and I really rely on her all the time. And thank you for the audience too for all these engaging questions and discussions. And I really hope that we will be able to invite Dr. Mimaki to Istanbul in the near future.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
All right, so thank you very much. So Seiko-san, have a nice evening on your side, and for people in Turkey, have a nice day.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for wonderful questions.